She set something on the floor of the chamber, and the room went very quiet. Not the quiet of respect, not the quiet of protocol. The quiet of 200 alien diplomats watching a human woman place a small black date, a chip on polished tile, in the center of the most powerful room in the hegemony, and then simply wait for them to understand what it meant. Magistrator Vet H. Kalundi RIX stood against the far wall. 8 feet of tarnished copper plating, for limbs, a diagonal scar across his chest that marked his ascension. His auditory slits, which in 30 years of testimony had never once moved out of sequence, were pressed flat against his skull. Admiral Desso Kafer did not look at him yet. She looked at the projection the chip cast into the air above the central aisle. 2 images, side by side. A document. A photograph. The photograph showed a boy with a gap-toothed smile and a slightly uneven paper crane held up for the camera. She let them look for a long time. Then she spoke. "This is the Solen Doctrine," she said. 11 words. The silence held. "If you kill a human being, we will find you." From 3 tiers up, in the carved delegate seats of the Hegemony Tribunal, someone heard the sound of Kalundi RIX's auditory slits peeling open. An involuntary reflex. The kind that happens when a body understands something the mind is still refusing. Okafor reached down and picked up the chip. She put it back in her pocket. "Stay close. The part that brought her here is the part that should never have happened at all." 112 years earlier, the engineers who built the Cradle fleet had a specific problem. They needed to hide the most powerful war armada in human history from a galaxy that believed humans had no war armada. The solution was not deception. Say exactly. It was more that they had put it in a place no one would think to look, in a dark matter shadow pocket beyond the Niven belt that the hegemony's charts marked as surveyed empty. And then they had left it there, waiting. The ships did not age in any meaningful sense. They were maintained by rotating skeleton crews on 18-month tours, people who signed documents they could not discuss with their families, who came home and said only logistics work. Deep range. Nothing interesting. Admiral Desso Kafer had done 6 of those tours before she commanded one. She had spent 19 years of her life in the gravel dark, keeping something in Ormison quiet and ready. She had a daughter who thought she managed supply chain audits for the Terran Compact. Her daughter was 31 years old. But this story does not begin with Okafor, or with the fleet, or with the war that was always there beneath the surface of the peace. It begins in a market, on a station, with a small boy trying to correctly pronounce the name of a world he had never visited, and the sound that made the Sand Ock Master vibrate his gill frills with joy. Crucible Dock was a cathedral built from other people's discards. That was the most honest way to describe it. 6 species merchant lanes had converged in the Viesen corridor for 200 years, and every time a ship was decommissioned or a hull section became redundant, pieces ended up bolted onto the station's exterior. Layers of architecture accreting like rings around a core that no one alive could quite remember building. From a distance, it looked organic. Close, you could read the history and the materials pale the sand pressure composite here, dark vet H alloy there, a stretch of something translucent and warm that might have been K.L. Hari glass or might have been something else entirely. The promenade ran through the station's widest string, 300 meters of commercial space covered by a curved viewport that showed the stars on one side and the slow rotation of the corridor's navigation array on the other. On-market cycle, which cycled every 4 standard days regardless of whether anyone felt ready. It was full. Dave and Solen had worked this station for 7 years. He knew the promenade the way people know places they did not choose but have come to need. He knew which vendors opened early and which ones were worth waiting for. He knew that the ventilation near the Vet H Customs bay ran cold and slightly sweet, recycled through some filter designed for a biology that found that combination pleasant, and he had learned to keep his coat buttoned on that end of the ring. He was a compact man, not short, exactly, but arranged economically, like someone had decided early on that no space should be wasted. He had lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at cargo manifests under the yellowish light of the Terran quarters' inadequate overhead panels. He had a habit, when he was holding something down, of pressing his thumb into the center of his opposite palm. It was not obvious. Most people never noticed it. Mira noticed it. She always had. She was watching him do it now, across 20 meters of promenade, as he stood at the Vet H Customs counter and kept his voice at the precise, careful register that 7 years had taught him was the correct register for a Terran compact broker in conversation with a VET-H official who had already decided the answer was no. The dispute was about an irradiation certification seal on a shipment of bulk grain. Specifically, whether the seal on crate manifest 7 through 23 matched the updated classification code the Hegemony's Agricultural Compliance Division had issued 14 weeks ago. Davin's position was that the update had not been flagged to Terran exporters at point of dispatch, and the certification was therefore valid under the previous standard. The customs officer's position was that it was not his problem. The officer's name, per his identification badge, was Previ Th Null. He was copper-plated in the way that high-ranking VET-H tended to be, though the copper had a slightly dull quality that suggested this posting was not what he had hoped for when he joined the Condorcance's service. He found the argument in front of him deeply uninteresting. He communicated this primarily through a studied lack of eye contact in the particular way he held his upper grip arms folded across his chest plate like a conclusion that had already been reached. Mira held Piet's hand and did not watch Davin, because watching Davin when he was working always made her want to intervene. And intervening was the one thing that Terran Compact family member was explicitly not supposed to do during a customs negotiation. She watched Piet instead. Her son was 8 years old and built like someone had assembled him from spare wonder. He had his father's economy of frame and her own tendency toward stillness when something caught his attention. Right now his attention was on the sand merchant moving through the promenade, maybe 10 meters away, a wide being with bioluminescent gill frills that pulsed in slow amber waves, carrying a rack of pressed coral art pieces on a harness across its back. Piet was trying, under his breath, to correctly pronounce the name of the Sand homeworld. He had been working on this for 6 days. The word had 4 syllables and a fricative midpoint that the human vocal apparatus was not naturally inclined toward. What came out of his mouth was a reasonable attempt that nonetheless produced a sound somewhere between his knees and a question. The Sand Dock Master, Isai, had been watching from his station near the corridor junction. When he heard it, his gill frills pulsed bright gold and shivered in a full visible wave, which Piet had learned meant laughter. Issei was large and soft-spoken and had been bringing Piet pressed coral pieces for 3 months, small flat discs in the geometric patterns the sands gave children as learning tools. He did not speak much Terran. He did not need to. Getting closer, Mira told Piet quietly. Issei's still laughing. He's laughing the way someone laughs when they're proud of you. Piet considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small rectangle of laminated cardstock, his transit pass for the Terran quarters restricted sections, the one that got him into the habitat ring without his parents. He had been folding it for the last 20 minutes. The result was a paper crane, mostly. The last fold was a little off. The wings sat at slightly uneven angles. One tipped up, one dipped down. He looked at it for a moment, then apparently decided it was finished. He leaned up and slipped it into the outer pocket of his mother's coat while she was watching Davin. For later, he told Issei, with enormous seriousness, as though this explained everything. Issei's gill frills pulsed gold again. Davin, at the counter, pressed his thumb into his palm. 300 meters away, further along the promenade, a sound like something giving way. The Hegemony's security forces were trained extensively. That much was documented. Their crowd suppression doctrine had been refined over 4 decades of practical application, tested against the biological profiles of the 6 primary species that used the VSN corridor regularly, updated every 18 months based on, after-action medical data. The resonance cannons they deployed were not crude tools. They were precisely calibrated to deliver a concussive shockwave at a frequency that disrupted the nervous systems of beings with dense musculature and reinforced skeletal architecture. For a VET-H, it felt like being pressed on, hard, for a moment. For the San, slightly worse. For a K. Ilhari, who had no functioning nervous system in the conventional sense, it was irrelevant. The doctrine's authors had considered the problem of species variation carefully. What they had not considered, because it had not yet been a problem, was a species whose bones were calibrated to a world of moderate gravity and evolutionary pressures that had never included shockwave weaponry. A species whose children, in particular, had not yet developed the secondary skeletal density that adults accumulated. A species that was new to the corridor, and small in number, and generally understood to keep their children at home. The guild clash that broke out in the promenade's eastern stretch that morning was between two Outer Rim merc and Al factions who had been building toward it for 6 weeks. The security forces responded in under 4 minutes. The response was professional and appropriate to the calibrated threat profile. The Solen Annas were on the wrong side of the deployment line. Davin heard it before he saw it. The distinctive deep hum of the resonance cannons spinning up, a sound he had heard once before at a demonstration on Plateau Station, where a VET-H dignitary had been very enthusiastic about the technology. He had thought, at the demonstration those things are remarkably large. He turned. He saw Mira. He saw Piety. He saw the deployment angle. Wait, he said. His voice came out wrong, too thin for the distance. He pushed away from the counter. He was moving. He was already saying it again, louder, to the security officer nearest him. Wait, there are soft tissue civilians in that corridor. Humans don't have car wrap as plating. You need to hold the line. The officer did not look at him. Dakinun's fired. The Hegemony Tribunal convened 6 days later on Plateau Station. Magistrate or VET-H Kalundi or IX presided. He had personally ratified 312 containment casualty rulings over the course of his tenure, a fact he found relevant to mention in his opening remarks, as context for the experience he brought to the bench. The rulings were a matter of administrative record. They had been reviewed, in each case, and found to be within the parameters of hegemony law. Piety-Davin Solen, A-Jate, was designated Containment Casualty Class 3, subtype rounding error. The designation was defined in the hegemony's security doctrine as a loss deemed negligible in proportion to the authorized security objective achieved. Ambassador Cleo Nars filed a formal protest. She was very good at her job. She had spent 11 years becoming fluent in exactly this kind of proceeding, learning the specific grammar of hegemony bureaucratic challenge, understanding which procedural avenues remained open when the system believed it had already closed them. The tribunal did not adjourn to consider her protest. Kalundi RIX looked down at her across the elevated dais, his auditory slits open and steady, his upper grip arms folded. Humanity must accept, he said, that the corridor operates under hegemony safety parameters, not parameters redesigned for the comfort of soft tissue fringe species. The incident was unfortunate. The outcome was within the range our doctrine anticipates. This matter is sealed. Ambassador Nars stood very still for a moment. Then she closed her case files, picked them up, and left the chamber. She did not speak to the press waiting outside. She boarded a Terran shuttle within the hour. By the time the shuttle cleared Plateau Station's docking range, every human vessel in hegemony space had received a coded priority signal that contained no text, only a timestamp and a 2-digit identifier. It was the signal for which the skeleton crews of the Cradle fleet had been maintaining readiness for 19 years. On Crucible Duct, the Terran quarter went dark. For 72 hours, Earth was silent. The VET-H Condorcans watched and waited for a formal response. They expected a grievance filing, perhaps a trade restriction announcement, which would be uncomfortable but manageable, possibly a public statement of condemnation, for which the appropriate procedural response had been drafted and prepared. What they did not expect was nothing. Kalandir IX told an aide. On the second day they are calculating what they can afford to sacrifice. A species this dependent on hegemony trade routes cannot sustain a prolonged economic dispute. They will file and accept a settlement offer within the week. His aide agreed. On the morning of the third day, every human ship in hegemony space cut its communications and jumped. Freighters, science vessels, passenger liners on regular commercial routes, gone from the tracking grid within 18 hours, not in sequence but all at once. As though someone had reached into the hegemony's navigation map and simply lifted all the green markers off the board. Human diplomats on 3 separate alien stations packed their quarters in silence and boarded the last available shuttles without explanation. One Kel Hari administrator on Plateau Station said later that the most unsettling part was that none of them seemed angry. They moved with the efficiency of people who had known for a long time that this moment would come and had simply been waiting for the calendar to arrive. The hegemony's Trading Analysis Division filed a brief noting that the human withdrawal was likely a protest measure and that hegemony markets could sustain the loss of Terran agricultural supply for approximately 11 months before secondary effects reached member state populations. This assessment was circulated to senior council members and received with measured confidence. On Crucible Dock, the Harbourmertz updated his station log with a single-line notation: Terran Quarter, all traffic ceased. Cause unknown. He thought for a moment, then added like a fire that has decided to move rather than go out. He was not sure why he wrote it. It seemed accurate. In a Terran processing facility on the station's neutral level, Davin and Mira Solen sat in a room with 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the docking ring. Mira had her coat folded on her lap. She had not put it down since the 3rd day after the promenade. Her hand rested on the outer pocket. Davin sat with his hands on his knees. He was looking at the window. He was not really looking at the window. A Terran Compact Liaison Officer named Ferris Young, careful with her words, clearly briefed on what to say and what not to, came in twice a day with food. Neither of them ate much of, and updates neither of them asked for. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Ferris came in and sat down without preamble. "You'll want to see this," she said. She set a portable display on the table between them. On the screen, the Hegemony's public navigation grid was updating in real time. Something was moving through the sector, beyond the Niven belt. The grid's anomaly detection system had flagged it as a spatial event, a cluster of readings consistent with stellar instability. An automated caution marker had populated around the affected coordinates. The readings were getting larger. Not a stellar event. The Hegemony's deep-range sensors took another 40 minutes to resolve the source. When they did, the analysis that came back to Plateau Station's Defense Coordination Office contained one notation that its author underlined 3 times. Carbon resonance dating on the hull materials is placing construction at between 108 and 116 years prior to present. Davin read that line. He pressed his thumb into his palm. He did not say anything. In the gravel dark, 112 years of cloaking fields powered down in sequence. The Cradle fleet did not emerge the way the Hegemony's vessels moved. With the clean geometric precision of ships designed to be observed and assessed and compared against known threat categories. The fracture drives that the Terran Engineering Corps had spent decades refining did not negotiate with spacetime. They argued with it. The rupture points that opened across the Niven belt's outer edge produced gravitational shockwaves that the Hegemony's stellar event sensors had been reading. For 19 years, background noise. The ships that came through were not beautiful. That was the first thing any observer noted. Later, they were not designed to be. They were iron-hulled class dreadnoughts, hulls plated in material thick enough that the mass of the ships bent local gravity slightly. Senior crew sometimes complaining that things rolled off tables toward the outer walls in a way they couldn't quite explain. They were Kodiak IA assault carriers, wide and flat and aggressive in their geometry. Built to deliver payload through hostile conditions with the attitude of something that had decided the fastest path between 2 points was through whatever was in the way. And at the formation's head, larger than anything else in the grid by a factor that the Hegemony's tactical assessment software initially returned as a data error, the Piat Solen, 42,000 tons of iron-hulled Clascom and Dreadnought, hull plating laid down in the 2nd decade of the fleet's construction. Still carrying the minor scoring of a test fire exercise from 70 years ago that the maintenance crews had decided to leave because removing it would have required dismantling a section of secondary plating that didn't need dismantling. Nearby debris, caught in the ship's extended gravity well, had already begun a slow, disorganized orbit. On the bridge, Admiral Deso Kafer stood at the tactical display with her hands clasped behind her back. She was 61. Her hair had gone white in her mid-40s, which she attributed to the particular quality of the light in the gravel dark. Though her daughter had always said it was stress, she wore a plain dress uniform, the ribbons on the chest marking engagements that were not in the Hegemony's public records. Her expression was the specific blankness of someone who had been waiting for a door to open for a very long time and had decided, somewhere along the way, not to expend energy on impatience. She watched the grid. The VED-H patrol line had locked targeting solutions on the Piat Solen within 3 minutes of the fleet's emergence. 40 vessels, the pride, as the Condorcance's defense literature described them, of 4 generations of military engineering. O'Kafer watched them orient. She watched them charge. "They're going to fire," her executive officer said. His name was Commander Teshe Arlo, 40 years old, 4th tour in the gravel dark. A man who communicated primarily through understatement and the angle of his eyebrows. "Yes," O'Kafer said. "Should we let them?" The Vet H patrol line fired coherent plasma lances, precisely the kind of weapon for which the hegemony's defense infrastructure was designed and optimized. They struck the Piat T-Solen across the forward hull in a coordinated spread, exactly as doctrine specified. The ship's ablative layering absorbed the thermal energy. Heat sinks dispersed the remainder into the surrounding space. The hull surface showed scorch marks in a pattern that, later, a maintenance officer would note bore a faint resemblance to a bracket of some kind. The Piat T-Solen did not move. O'Kafer let 10 seconds pass. Kinetic batteries, she said. Chef, full solution on the patrol line. Fire. The mass drivers engaged. Tungsten osmium composite rounds, dense enough and fast enough that the energy shielding the hegemony's engineers had spent centuries perfecting was, in a straightforward physical sense, irrelevant to them. Energy shielding was designed to deflect or absorb energy. The rounds were not energy. 23 seconds later, where the Vet H patrol line had been, there was a dispersed field of metallic particulate expanding in a rough sphere across the coordinates. No hegemony vessel reported a hull breach. No Terran ship reported damage above surface scoring. A.R. Lowe looked at the tactical display for a moment. His eyebrows said several things. Broadcast, O'Kafer said. Every screen on Crucible Dock and Plateau Station flickered simultaneously. The hegemony's encryption protocols, which the Condorcance's communications division had certified as penetration-resistant to any known signal technology, were bypassed in under 4 seconds. Later, a review board would determine this was accomplished through a method that the hegemony had not known existed. The review board would file this finding under ongoing assessment and leave it there. On every public display, every personal device, every commercial holo panel across both stations, the same face appeared. Admiral O'Kafer. She was standing on the bridge of the Piat T-Solen. The tactical displays behind her showed the dispersed remains of the patrol line. She did not draw attention to this. She did not need to. Hegemony Tribunal. Her voice, through the Terran communications systems, was clear and not especially loud. I am Admiral Dessa O'Kafer, Terran United Navy. 4 days ago, Magistrator Vet H. Calundir, der IX classified a child's death as a rounding error. We have reviewed his mathematics. We find an error. She paused. Magistrate Calundir IX will present himself to Berth 9 on Crucible Dock within 10 minutes for transport to Terran jurisdiction and trial. If he does not, we will come to wherever he is and collect him. Another pause. We are very good at finding doors. The broadcast cut. In the processing facility on Crucible Dock, Davin Solent sat with his hands on his knees, watching the portable display on the table in front of him. The liaison officer Ferris was very still. Beside him, Nira had one hand on her coat, on the outer pocket, on the shape, beneath the fabric. Davin did not feel what he had expected to feel. He pressed his thumb into his palm. He did not speak. On the tribunal chamber of Plateau Station, 340 meters from where Calundir IX was already moving toward a secondary exit corridor, High Arbiter Veen Suth sat behind the elevated dais and looked at the empty room and thought, for the first time in his 30-year tenure, that the doctrine might need to be revised. Down on Crucible Dock, in the promenade where 6 weeks ago the morning light had come through the curved viewport in Piat T-Solen had tried to pronounce a word he'd been practicing all week. The first boarding torpedo hit the outer hull. It did not explode. The thermal breaching charge took 11 seconds. That was the part that stayed with people afterward. Not the size of the Marines, not the weapons. The 11 seconds. The tribunal's construction teams had specified a hull thickness on Crucible Dock's outer ring that they had been confident, in writing, was sufficient against any known breach technology. 11 seconds was not in the specification. The circular plug of hull material blew inward. Through the smoke, the Mark 9 warden suits emerged. The garrison waiting on the other side of the breach had arranged themselves correctly. 30 Vet H security troopers in full carapace armor, plasma rifles at shoulder level, covering the entry point in overlapping fire angles exactly as doctrine specified. They were well trained. They had run this scenario in simulation. The simulation had not included 9-foot hydraulic-assisted ceramic-plated humans who moved at a speed that the simulation's programmers had not thought to model because nothing that size was supposed to move that fast. The garrison fired. The plasma bolts hit the leading Marine's chest plates and dispersed. The heat sinks ran warm. That was all. Captain L.O. and Brig. Through her suit's external speakers, said contact front, lethal first authorized, clear the promenade. Her voice was synthesized by the suit's audio system, which processed and ray-projected it with a resonance that the suit's designers had not specifically intended but had never seen fit to remove. The kinetic carbines answered. 28 seconds. Then, quiet. Briggs stepped over a fallen trooper and looked out across the promenade. 300 meters of commercial space. Thousands of alien civilians, every species the corridor knew, pressed against walls and under market stalls and behind whatever cover they had managed to find. Not moving, barely breathing. She raised one armored hand. Her squad halted. She activated the translation matrix. Terran Marines, she said, her synthesized voice carrying the full length of the promenade. We do not fire on non-combatants. Stay where you are. Keep your heads down. We are here for one person. Nobody moved. The squad formed a column and walked. Weapons angled down. Magnetic boots on polished tile. A rhythm like something mechanical and very certain. Past closed vendor stalls. Past the Kai El Hari art gallery with its latticed front still intact. Past the spot, which none of the Marines had been briefed on and none of them knew to notice, where the Sandok master had vibrated his Gilfril's gold 6 weeks at a sound a small boy made. They walked toward the central spire. Issei watched them pass from inside his dockmaster's station. Through the narrow side window he had cracked open to centimeters because the main feed was showing static. He had been on Crucible Dock for 14 years. He had seen guild clashes and quarantine lockdown and a VET-H political delegation that had once managed to shut down 3 commercial corridors simultaneously through sheer procedural arrogance. He had not seen this. What struck him, after, was what the Marines did not do. They did not look at the vendors' stalls. They did not slow to assess anything that wasn't on the path to where they were going. They moved with the specific discipline of beings who had made, at some earlier point, a very clear decision about what this operation was and was not, and who were now simply executing that decision. That, Issei thought, was more frightening than chaos. He had filed, in the days after Piet T. Solen died, a formal witness statement with the hegemony's legal intake office. He had waited 3 weeks for a confirmation of receipt. What he received instead was a standardized form notifying him that the matter had been classified as resolved and that no further testimony was required. He had put the form in the recycling receptacle and then taken it back out and put it in a drawer. He was not sure why. He reached under his station console now and opened the drawer. He looked at the form for a moment. Then he closed the drawer again. On the overhead display, the feed came back. The corridor outside the tribunal sealed blast doors. Warden suits arrayed in a half circle. Someone placing objects against the door surface small, cylindrical, attached with magnetic clips at precise intervals along the frame. Issei had not heard of seismic resonators. He watched the Marines step back from the door. He watched them wait. The blast doors did not explode. They groaned. A low, structural sound, felt more than heard. A vibration that ran through the station's floor plating and up through the soles of Issei's feet. Then a crack appeared down the exact center of the vanadium carbide surface. Then, another. Then the doors separated along the crack and fell, slowly and heavily, into pieces, into the chamber beyond. The dust rose. Through it walked Admiral Deso Kafer. The tribunal chamber's architects had, in fact, been deliberate about the ceiling height. 60 meters. The specific figure was documented in the original design specifications, under a heading that read, without apparent irony, psychological calibration petitioner experience. The intent was that anyone standing on the chamber floor, looking up at the tiers of delegates seating rising in concentric arcs, and the floating days where the magistrate's bench rested on its ray poles or field, should feel the weight of the institution bearing down from above. Okafer walked in and looked up. She took it in without visible reaction. Then she looked at the delegates. Then she looked at Kalundir IX, who had not made it to the secondary exit. His upper grip arms were folded across his chest plate. The fold was not the studied certainty it had been 6 days ago in this same room. The auditory slits on either side of his head were pressed flat. Okafer walked to the center of the chamber floor. She stopped at the intersection of the central aisle. Around the tiers, 200 delegates from member species of the hegemony tribunal sat in various configurations of stillness. YK, El Hari representative, which expressed distress by extending secondary tendrils from its collar ridge, had extended all four. The Sands senior diplomat had both hands pressed flat against the desk in front of it, gill frills entirely retracted. 3 Vet counselors, near the upper tier, had not moved since the doors fell. High Arbiter Veen Suth, on the elevated days, gripped the edges of his desk with both hands and said nothing. Okafor reached into her dress uniform's interior pocket and removed a matte black date, a chip. She looked at it for a moment. Then she walked to the center island, set it on the polished floor. She stepped back. A Marine behind her activated a projection field. The chip held 2 items. The first was a document Hegemony, Internal Security Review. Resonance Cannon Biological Impact Assessment. Dated 81 years prior to present. Marked for restricted circulation and never publicly released. Section 7. Paragraph 4. Read. In the Hegemony Zone, administrative language, that deployment in proximity to low-density biological species, specifically those with non-reinforced skeletal architecture, presented a high probability of lethal outcome and that relevant safety protocols should be considered for revision. The protocols had not been revised. The second item was a photograph. School portrait. A boy, 8 years old, yap-toothed, holding up a paper crane with slightly uneven wings and smiling at the camera with the specific expression of someone who has just finished a thing they are proud of. Okafor let the room look. 30 seconds. 40. No one spoke. Somewhere in the upper tier, the sound of a Vet delegate's auditory slit cycling involuntarily. The biological click of a stress response that the delegate could not suppress. Kalundirix's slits peeled open. He had not meant them to. Okafor looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then she looked up. This is the Soul End Doctrine, she said. Her voice was level, not raised, not performing, just present. The way a fact is present. It supersedes the Zenith Accords, the VSN protocols, and every safety waiver your legal architecture has constructed over 3 centuries to protect your institutions from accountability. She let the chamber be quiet. Its text is 11 words. The silence held. If you kill a human being, we will find you. From 3 tiers up. Sound. Kalundirix's auditory slits, peeling further open. The involuntary hinge of them. A clicking that carried in the room's acoustics farther than it should have. Okafor bent down. She picked up the chip. She put it back in her pocket. She stood there for a moment with the portrait projected in the air behind her. The boy and his crane floating in the still space above the central aisle. And she said, quietly, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room, we tried to be something gentler than what we are. We were doing well. A pause. We were genuinely doing well. Another pause. Shorter. You made us stop. She turned to the Marines holding Kalundirix. Take him home. Post-climax thread. The photograph projection stayed active for 4 seconds after Okafor turned away. No one in the chamber moved to deactivate it. Veen Suth looked at it. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Later, asked by a staff member whether he wanted the incident formally classified, he sat for a long time and then said find out if the child had any other family. In the processing facility, Davin watched the chamber feed cut out. The display went to static, then to a Hegemony emergency broadcast that was repeating a holding message about station security protocols. Ferris, beside him, said something. He didn't hear what. He was looking at the place on the display where the feed had been. He pressed his thumb into his palm. Mira, next to him, put her hand over his. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. She was watching the display too, but her other hand was on her coat, on the outer pocket, and he understood, without her saying anything, that she had been holding on to that specific weight all morning. He did not feel triumph. He had expected something. Some shift, some easing of the thing that had been sitting in the center of his chest since the promenade. The Cradle fleet was outside. Kalundirix was in Marine custody. The chamber had seen the photograph in the document and the 11 words. The thing in his chest did not move. He thought about 8 years old. He thought about the gap in the front teeth. The one that had been there since the left lateral incisor came in a little late and the permanent tooth had arrived before the gap fully closed. The one that Piety had found embarrassing for about 3 weeks and then forgotten about because something else had become more interesting. He thought about the way Piety said the word specifically with extra syllables that kept migrating around. He thought about a paper crane with uneven wings. Mira's hand tightened on his. Outside the processing facility window, the docking ring of Crucible Dock was quiet. The Kodiak eye carriers had pulled back to minimum safe distance from the station. The Cradle fleet held position beyond the Niven Belt. Thousands of ships, darkened, enormous and still. They had held position for 6 hours since the breach and made no further demands. One the Sand, diplomatic observer, in a personal communication to a colleague on a different station, wrote, "It is the stillness that is the worst of it. A thing that has already done what it came to do, and is simply waiting to see if there is anything else that needs doing. You keep expecting it to leave. It does not leave." Kalandir IX was processed through the Terran Compact's legal intake system with the efficiency of an institution that had been technically prepared for exactly this for 60 years without ever expecting to use the preparation. He said very little in transit. He maintained the studied stillness that had served him in the chamber for 3 decades. The deliberate absence of visible reaction that subordinates had learned to read as authority. On the second day, when a junior legal officer delivered his formal charge documentation, he reviewed it without comment. On the third day, he asked to speak to Terran legal counsel. The request was granted. His counsel, a compact woman named Advocates Oren Pale, who had the particular quality of appearing deeply uninterested in anything you were saying while absorbing all of it, explained to him that the charges included negligent homicide and deliberate suppression of biological impact data in security doctrine review. He said, "I acted within the parameters of hegemony law." Pale looked at her notes. "Yes," she said, "that is part of what we're charging." Kalandir IX's auditory slit cycled. Pale did not look up. Back on Plateau Station, the Hegemony Tribunal convened an emergency session 11 days after the breach. High Arbiter Veen Suth opened the session with a motion to formally censure the session that had issued the rounding error classification. The motion passed without a dissenting vote, which was notable because the session being censured had also passed without a dissenting vote. 3 senior VET-H security commanders submitted voluntary resignations before the morning was over. The Agricultural Compliance Division issued a retroactive notification to all Terran exporters clarifying the 14-week Cold Seal classification update and apologizing for the delay in distribution. Every Hegemony member state revised its crowd control deployment protocols within the week. The revisions were comprehensive. They used the words low-density biological species 17 times and the word human once. At the end, in a parenthetical, Ambassador Cleo Nars, who had returned to Plateau Station 48 hours after the breach to resume her posting. "Read the revisions carefully." She read them twice. She set them down on her desk and looked out the window at the docking ring for a while. Then she made a note to herself in the margin of the last page. It read, "They still cannot say the word." On Crucible Dock, Issei filed his witness testimony. He had been writing it for 3 weeks. It was the longest document he had ever produced. The first 11 pages covered what he had observed on the promenade on the day of the can on deployment. The sequence of events, the timeline, the positions of the security forces relative to the Terran civilians. The last paragraph was 3 sentences. He was 8 years old. He was trying to say the name of my home world, and he almost had it. He gave his mother a paper crane, and he called it for later, as though later was a thing you could give someone. He submitted the document and closed the file. 6 weeks after the promenade, Tellland, Virginia. The rain had been falling since before dawn. The specific soft insistence of spring rain that does not announce itself, just arrives and continues. The oak tree at the east edge of the cemetery had not yet fully leafed, and the branches made a partial shelter that was more gesture than function. The ground under it was dark and damp and recently turned. Davin Solen stood at the edge of the grave with his hands at his sides. The headstone was black marble. Sma. The carver had done good work. The letters were clean and deeply cut. The way stone should be cut if it's going to hold words for a long time. Pietit Davin Solen, he was always watching the sky. Mira stood beside him. She had her coat on. The same coat. Her hand was in the outer pocket. They had been standing there for a while without talking, which was fine. There are things that do not need filling. A sound behind them, the soft compression of wet grass underfoot, careful steps keeping distance. President Analyze Cord, who had succeeded Mateo in the last election and had been handed the Cradle fleet as part of her transition briefing in the way you are handed a very old, very loaded thing and told to be careful with it, stopped a respectful distance back and waited. Davin acknowledged her without turning around. "Madam President." "Davin." "Mira." Her voice was quiet. The trial concluded this morning. Kalundir IX was found guilty on all counts. Negligent homicide, willful suppression of impact data, and security doctrine review. He'll serve the sentence at a black site facility under Terran jurisdiction. No extradition provisions. Mira said nothing for a moment. Does it? She said. Cord understood the unfinished question. No, she said. It doesn't. The rain fell. The Condorcans has agreed to a joint oversight mechanism for all security deployments in mixed species zones. Cord continued, quietly, not filling the silence so much as leaving it something to hold. 31 species have formally requested independent review of their crowd control protocols. The Solen Doctrine has been submitted for inclusion in the Hegemony's core legal framework. They'll ratify it. They don't have a reason not to. Anymore. Davin looked at the headstone. The rain ran down the black marble and collected along the carved letters and darkened them. The universe is safe for us now, he said. As safe as we can make it, Cord said, which is very safe. The Cradle fleet will maintain active rotation. Not the gravel dark. Deployed. Visible. He nodded. He did not say anything else. The president stayed a few minutes more and then left the way she had come, footsteps quiet on the wet grass, giving them the space that was theirs. Davin looked at the stone. He thought we built 42,000 tons of ship and named it after you. We have the most powerful war fleet in known history, and it answers to your name on its hull. The galaxy will say your name when it says the doctrine that now governs how they treat our people. The Hegemony's legal framework will carry you in it for 100 years. 8 more years. He thought it the way you think something that has no receiver. Just thought it. We just needed 8 more years. You were going to be 16 and embarrassed by us, going to be 22 and studying something strange somewhere far away, and going to be 30 and competent in your own person, and we were going to watch all of it. 8 more years. Nira pulled her hand from the outer pocket. She held the paper crane. It was soft at the creases from handling. The laminate surface worn where she had pressed it flat against her sternum on the third day after the dock and every day since. The wings sat at their uneven angles. One tipped up. Shone. She bent and set it on the base of the headstone. She looked around for a moment. Found a river stone near the tree's roots. Smooth and gray. She set it on the crane's body. A weight to keep the rain from taking it. The crane sat there with its uneven wings. Still imperfect. Still entirely itself. Above the clouds, in a high stable orbit that was new and would remain, a Cradle fleet forward watch vessel made its slow transit across the sky. Davin looked up. The clouds were too thick to see it, but he knew the altitude, the rotation period, the coverage arc. He had read the briefing documents. He knew it was there. He looked back down at the stone, at the crane, at the small river stone holding it in place against the rain. He pressed his thumb into his palm once, and then let his hand open.